preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
My name is Steve Shaw. I'm the director of the Radius Institute, and along with Levi Darby, the associate education director and head of the Jewish Omnibus series, and my colleague David Zoni and Monica Devins, we've planned this series together. This is our last of 5 evenings, and it's always the time, I guess, when we expect to learn the truth. And as a friend of mine points out, I leave these evenings both elated and depressed, in part because I think that what we're dealing with are my conflicts and your conflicts. And perhaps what we're good at doing is putting both sides of the dilemma together. Whether we can really offer you the ultimate synthesis is something which perhaps is only up to you. One of the hallmarks of the modern world is the fact that we're confronted with an overabundance of life choices in almost every area. Traditions, which many of our ancestors saw as both sacred and exclusive, are now viewed as mere individual options in what some sociologists have called a marketplace of spiritual and cultural ideas. How we arrive at viable and focused Jewish worldviews, which importantly can also be transmitted to another generation, is the challenge facing us today at this last evening, and to some degree has really been a thread which has gone through this entire series. Our 2 speakers, Art Green, as a person and as a teacher and as a scholar, has worked to create a spiritually serious but non-fundamentalistic Jewish path or Jewish option. Art possesses an unusual sensitivity to the classical framework of traditional Judaism, and especially its manifestation in Jewish mystical texts. He's an expert on Hasidism and Jewish mysticism. And as Dean of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, on leave from his position at the Department of Religion at the University of Pennsylvania, Art has been both a shaper and a thoughtful critic of major trends in contemporary Jewish life. Our second speaker is Yitz Greenberg, who in founding CLAL, a Center for Jewish Learning and Leadership, has attempted both to educate a new generation of Jewish leaders and to foster a much-needed intra-religious dialogue, a dialogue among warring factions of the Jewish people. Most recently, Yitz has sparked a public debate about what he feels is an impending and dangerous denominational split within the Jewish family. For the last 15 years, Yitz has attempted to explain the meaning of Jewish existence, both theologically and through the regimen of Jewish observance, in light of the trauma of the Holocaust, as well as a dialectic of the drama of the birth of Jewish national sovereignty. And finally, our moderator, Samuel Norich. Sam combines an extensive knowledge of contemporary Jewish organization and political life with an unusually broad background in sociology and Jewish history. For the last 5 years, as head of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Sam has charted a new course for a distinguished institution with deep roots in the culture of Eastern European Jewry. I'm therefore pleased to turn over tonight's program to Sam Norich and our 2 speakers.
Six, Steve, but who's counting? Actually, I want to offer no impediment to the speedy solution of the problems facing the Jews. So let me then open the program and ask Art Green to speak first.
Thank you. Good evening. One of the lesser known facts, I'm sure, about the career of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is that for 1 year, a long time ago, he was the Hillel director at Brandeis University, which happened to be the year I was a freshman at Brandeis University. So we know each other for a very long time, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with somebody who will always, in some ways, be one of my rebbes. I think it's clear, even to the most casual observer of Jewish life in these closing decades of the 20th century, that we are emerging from a turning point in the history of the Jewish people. Emerging from a turning point. The turning point has come and gone. The earth-shattering events of mid-century, of the mid-20th century, the destruction of European Jewry and the establishment of a Jewish society and state in Eretz Yisrael. These events that we've talked about for the last 20 years as the great earth-shakers of our time are events of the past. We are beyond them. We are entering a new epoch, an epoch that exists in the wake of these events, but is not only of their making. It's a new epoch in the history of the Jewish people, one in which the nature, the content, the meaning, especially the meaning of Jewish existence, is yet to be defined almost altogether. It's far too early to say what the character of Jewish life in the succeeding period will be like. And yet at the same time, I think as we stand 5, 10, 20 years into a new epoch that may be of short duration, maybe an epoch that lasts for hundreds of years, we have no way of knowing. As we stand, I would no longer say at the threshold of a new age in the history of the Jewish people, but really already inside the threshold of a new age, having crossed the threshold, as we begin to look around the chamber, if you will, that we've entered. I think some of the characteristics of Judaism in this new age are beginning to become clear, and some of them surprisingly so. It appears, of all things, that the surviving Jewry of the 21st century, and when I say surviving Jewry, I of course refer to a kind of she'erit ha'pleta, those who will remain with us in the Jewish community, and I don't talk about numbers because I don't understand them. It appears that the surviving Jewry of the 21st century will be far more Jewish, judged by such classic standards as learning, traditional observance, and pride in Jewish distinctiveness, than was the Jewry that immediately preceded it. Witness the new growth, sometimes accompanied by militancy and triumphalism, of orthodoxy, something that would have been totally unpredictable to any observer of the Jewish scene, especially the American Jewish scene, only a generation ago. Witness, on the other end of the spectrum, the turn among kibbutz intellectuals in Israel toward rediscovering the sources of Judaism, asking what Jewish identity has to do with emerging Israeli identity. Witness the parallel process among a new generation of American Jewish intellectuals. I would say both the authors and the readers who have made the journey together, if you will, from the Jewish catalog to back to the sources. Witness the chavurot, the minyanim, even now the rebirth of the Reconstructionist movement, which, as one rabbi recently quipped to me, itself should be taken as sufficient proof that Mordechai Kaplan was a bit hasty in denying the resurrection of the dead. Witness, if you will, I live there, I know. Witness, if you will, on a broader and less intellectual level, 100 things. The growth of Hanukkah and the decline of Christmas among Jews. The writing of new ceremonies, new ways of Jewish celebrating, kinds of creativity emerging in Jewish literary circles. Witness the growth of American Jewish literature and the readership of American Jewish literature over the last several decades. Even some revivals of interest in Jewish music, other kinds of things that would have been hard to predict a while ago. There seems to be emerging a generation of Jews that is more willing, publicly, openly, religiously, culturally, in every way, to identify itself as happily and unproblematically, unambiguously Jewish. Some other characteristics of Judaism as it's beginning to emerge for the 21st century. A decline, thankfully from my point of view as a Jewish professional, a decline in Jewish professionalism. That is to say, Judaism, the religion of the Jews, is coming to be seen finally less and less as a spectator sport. Fewer and fewer people want to sit passively in the back rows and watch rabbis and cantors perform the theatrical show up there on the stage. That's no great surprise to us, given general tendencies in American cultural life. What's interesting, perhaps, is that the same thing seems to be happening in Jewish organizational life and in Jewish philanthropy. People want to do, they want to take an active role. The age in which people will sit back and let the professional, without criticism, act for them, take their money and make decisions for them, run the program for them, create the institution for them, that in some ways seems to be on the decline. Those who will remain involved in Jewish life will be very much involved. Those who were peripheral indeed are quickly in the process, of course, of drifting away. There is, in the Jewish life emerging for the 21st century, in some ways, an inevitable decline in the ethnic components that for my parents' generation and for me still in my childhood made up a great deal of Jewish identity. We have totally moved away from the immigrant experience. Those who will live into the 21st century will mostly be fourth generation, fifth generation American Jews who no longer know what Yiddish accents sound like, who no longer think, as I did when I was a kid, that when you turn 60, you start speaking with that kind of accent. Nobody was over 60 and spoke English without some kind of accent. We have truly arrived in America. The generation coming is an entirely American generation, and that means linguistically, gastronomically, all kinds of ways. We have moved significantly away from the naturalness of Jewish ethnic identity. Witness the fact that a large proportion of members of Jewish communities in some parts of the country, especially the mid and far west, were not born Jews, but are Jews by choice. Those people, with all the best of intentions, don't respond to the smell of cooking chicken soup the way one who was raised in my grandmother's kitchen would, and that's with a good deal of ambivalence. I hate to say. So a good deal of natural, born in the blood, Jewish ethnic identity is disappearing. At the same time, I must say, we seem to have retained among Jews. My students at Penn over the last several years, of course now I'm working with rabbinical students, so I expect to see it there, but in the secular university, working with a broader cross-section of Jewish kids, grandchildren of people born in America, I was surprised to see how strong the sense of Jewish identity and Jewish separatism still was. Jewish fraternities, non-Jewish fraternities, Jewish social groups, non-Jewish social groups, Jewish floors in the dorm, non-Jewish floors in the dorm. Kids telling me, sophomores in college telling me just a couple of years ago, yes, of course we have non-Jewish friends in class and lab, but when we go out for pizza, it's with Jews. Pizza with pepperoni, but still all with Jews. There is a sense, a surprising sense, among Jews who should be entirely comfortable with their American identity, of liking being with Jews, of being more comfortable with other Jews. So I predict that a kind of ethnicity will survive, a kind of sense of separate identity and delight in that separate identity. Most of it, I think, not born of paranoia or discomfort, will survive, but the Jewishness of its content will diminish very rapidly unless there is some other sort of infusion. With that, alongside it, there's a concomitant growth, I think, in the religious component of Jewish identity. And that, of course, is much of what I want to speak about tonight, because that's my own real interest. Much of the talk about growth in religious identity, religious formation is superficial, is shallow. Most things in the world are. Here and there, I think it's taken serious roots and needs to be examined as a real religious phenomenon. The turn to religion, of course, is complicated by the fact that it is both a real phenomenon. There are people asking religious questions. We'll talk about them. And the turn to religion is also a strategy for survival for Jews in America. We Jews learned rather quickly as we left the ethnic ghettos of the city and entered WASP suburbia in the 1950s and 1960s. I guess those of you here in Manhattan are those who didn't enter WASP suburbia, but I can assure you, as one who was raised out there, that it was legitimate to be Jewish only because you had a church of your own, only because you had a separate religious identity. Jews learned in the 50s that by the third generation it was expected that Jewish kids would eat chow mein and Italian kids would eat matzah and we would all speak English and all these differences would pass away, and intermarriage would also be the legitimate American way to do things. Unless they adopted this strategy, I think that was first probably popularized by Will Herberg and in part as a strategy of seeing ourselves as one of the three great religious groups in America. America is not made up of WASPs and Italians and Armenians and Greeks and Jews, but is made up of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Religious difference would remain a sacred cow in America, and there would not be pressure, at least by the formal arm of society, to assimilate if one asserted that one's difference was based in religious principle. So the turn to religion among American Jews is a combination of authentic religious seeking and a strategy for legitimating Jewish separatist survival. It is sometimes hard, I think, to separate those two strands from one another. Maybe more important than all this, or the most important part of all this, is that there is, I think, a group of Jews who are engaged in serious searching. They're asking themselves what it will mean to create a Judaism that speaks to the next generation and the next century. I think they and we know that if I could take the Judaism that my grandparents brought from Lithuania and gave to me, and I could, without any corruption at all, take that Judaism and hand it down to my child and my grandchild, exactly as it was brought over from the old country, without changing a thing, being entirely faithful to the tradition, what I would have essentially is Judaism in formaldehyde. Judaism preserved artificially. A Judaism that wouldn't work anymore and wouldn't speak to the needs of the next generation or the generation after that. We Jews, after all, in this century have been through a series of incredible revolutions. The revolution of Zionism and Jewish national identity, the rebellion against tradition by those who emigrated and had the courage to leave the shtetl and come to America, the incredible revolution and transformation of the Holocaust itself. It's inconceivable to us that we return to Judaism as it was before those revolutionary changes. There are Jews, a significant number of Jews, returning to the tradition, a kind of Ba'alei Tshuva, if you will, returners to Judaism, but who insist that in their return they will be involved in reshaping Judaism as well as being reshaped by it. The relationship has to be a mutual one. These Jews are willing to study, they're willing to experiment with observance, but they want to know why they're doing it. Jews outside of Orthodoxy need an alternative to the old authority structure, one that has to do with ultimate meaning, and that somehow, however defined, has to do with God. The connection between Jewish identity and Jewish practice and the fun of Jewish study and the fun of being involved in Judaism, and a search for the ultimate, a search for ultimate values, a search for meaning in life, is a connection that has to be made and is a hard one for many. Interestingly, I think those who turn to orthodoxy from outside the Orthodox community. The more typical Baalei Tshuva often are turning to Hasidism within Orthodoxy, which is probably the kind of traditional Judaism that most clearly articulates the connection between observance and relationship with God, though I'm not always sure that that's what they get in Hasidism once they arrive there. Then there are, of course, lots of Jews on the scene for whom the word God still sticks in their throats, who really can't say it comfortably, really can't make that word their own, and yet are still asking religious questions. If they're asking, what does Judaism have to do with human self-fulfillment? Or how will my Jewishness help me confront death or life or marital difficulties or child raising or failure in life or success in life for that matter? Or what's it all about? And what does Judaism have to do for me with what's it all about? Since I'm somehow a non-believer and yet at the same time attracted to the tradition and see a kind of wisdom there, how can I use that wisdom without somehow mortgaging my independence, giving up my autonomy, and entering into a traditional world where I really don't feel I belong? Those are religious questions. And whether they're asked out of traditional religious language, I think nowadays they're asked with a kind of frankness, which is healthy. Yes, I want to know what it will do for me. And at the same time with a kind of post-California culture self-help attitude that sometimes frightens me as being a bit selfish. What can Judaism do to make me more what I want to be? We've already begun, as I say, to move into this new age. We cannot get together and decide whether the move into a new age in Jewish history will be a good idea for the Jews or a bad idea. We've already crossed the threshold. In order to see it more clearly, however, I'd like to have a better idea of where we come from. What's been the age from which we've just emerged? And how has that age begun to give birth to a new one? We will not comprehend the new one, we will not overcome our fears of it, which I think are considerable, unless we understand something of its roots in the history of our times. This history in some ways will be, as you'll see, a highly personal history of a very particular generation. We stand at the end, perhaps just beyond the end, of modernity as a period in the history of the Jewish people. Modernity is an age, whether it begins with Spinoza, with Moses Mendelssohn, or with the first Apicardus and your grandparent Stettel, modernity is an age marked by skepticism in matters of faith, marked by progressive alienation from the tradition in matters of behavior, marked by a growth in almost complete identification with a Western culture that was welcoming and beckoning to Jews, a Western culture that was itself in the process of secularizing as it stepped out of its own Christian moorings and therefore was felt to be a neutral place where Jews as well as others would be welcome. It was, of course, that Western culture of the last 2 centuries, a high culture, an enticing culture. Assimilation always happens to a higher cultural level, not a lower one. No one wants to join a lower culture. The level of knowledge, level of culture in the West in the past 2 centuries has been so much higher than the level of Jewish knowledge and level of Jewish culture among most Jews that the assimilatory process was almost inevitable. We Jews entered this modern world as what I like to call relatively recent emigres from the later Middle Ages. Most of us come from places, geographically that is, where all the steps that prepared Westerners for modernity never happened. The shtetl of the Ukraine or Lithuania never had a Renaissance, never had a Reformation, never had an 18th century Enlightenment. The theology we had down until the turn of the 20th century, that is to say the theology known by anybody east of the Elbe in any case, was medieval theology. The social organization the Jewish community had was a form of late medieval oligarchy. The structure of the community itself relationship between rabbi and community, relationship between parnasim, or those who led the community, and others, was all right out of the late medieval world. Suddenly, quickly, sometimes by a boat trip to New York, sometimes only by a train ride to Warsaw, we were cast out of the late Middle Ages and caught up in the maelstrom of modernity. For some of us, it happened in 1880 in our families. For some of us, in 1910. For Yemenite Jews, of course, it happened overnight in the most dramatic way in 1949, and they're still recovering from the trauma of that. All of us, I think, are still recovering from the trauma of having been cast so late and so rapidly and so without preparation into the world of modernity. What happened to us when we entered modernity without preparation? Simple. Not simple. Part of it simple. We became its most uncritical and enthusiastic supporters. We Jews were moderns par excellence, anxious to rid ourselves of the ghetto, rid ourselves of the sense of social inferiority that accompanied it. We secularized, at least on a superficial level, almost overnight. From being a highly traditional community, we became, in a generation or a generation and a half, by all the statistical surveys that exist, church, synagogue attendance, etc., we became the most secularized community in all of America. The great writers of Jewish modernity, I guess, most clearly Kafka and Agnon, but many of the writers in Yiddish and Hebrew as well, chronicled the trauma of this transformation. Our intellectuals, Achad Ha'am, Kaplan, others, tried to create a new theology for us, in some ways I think a surrogate theology, while our real goal, that is to say, a theology to allow people to express Jewish loyalty and identity when they could no longer believe the old theology, which indeed had collapsed under its own weight overnight because it came out of the medieval world. You know, Judaism is true because 600,000 people saw the Torah being given. Therefore it can't be untrue. Or the theology of Metonisch Pflegen, which many of us, at least by grandparents, if not by parents, were brought up with. You just don't ask questions. Those collapsed overnight, so there were attempts made to replace those for Jews who could no longer believe them. But the real goal of Jews in America and elsewhere, I think the real goal of Jews in the modern world was that of contributing and being accepted by the emerging culture of the post-sectarian West. The real ideal of Jews was a Freud or an Einstein, somebody who had really made it big in the secular universe. Those were our heroes. Our enemies, of course, also saw us, not without some reality base, as the most modern of moderns. Jewish cosmopolitanism, Jewish rootlessness, the Jews as harbingers of modernity, therefore of destroyers of traditional values, destroyers of the German family, destroyers of the ethic of the German countryside, you remember, in the Nazi propaganda of the 30s, but also Jewish cosmopolitans in the Soviet propaganda of the 60s and 70s. They too recognized that we somehow were modern man, modern humans, almost to a degree of parody. Most of us in America became the most active advocates of melting pot ideology, and melting pot ideology in America became another kind of pseudo-theology for us. We were such lovers of the melting pot because we hoped that here in America, the old hatred of Jews that characterized ethnic difference in the past could be forgotten, and that we really were going to be able to participate in the great experiment of forging a new nation, if you will, to quote a phrase that I guess belongs to this week in the calendar, and something of which we would truly be a part rather than outsiders. It took us a generation and a half or two. It took us probably from 1920 to 1968 and the confrontation with new ethnicity in the face of the Black Revolution to ask what the price would be for acceptance into the world of the majority and whether we really were willing to pay it. Most of us were not just moderns, because that's a kind of fact of the cultural age in which you live, but we were modernists, that is to say, believers in modernity. We took unmitigated and often uncritical pride in the improvement of human life brought about by technological advances, and proudly pointed out how many Jews were in the forefront of each and every technological discipline and scientific area. The traditional sense of purposeful creation, the creation of the world by God in Judaism, was replaced by a kind of humanistic Darwinism, if you will, a sureness of mankind's march from the so-called primitive to the so-called advanced in every realm of civilization. Things were getting better and better. Humanity was becoming more advanced, less imprisoned by superstition, less primitive. Revelation was replaced by the religion of scientific discovery, the faith that every mystery would yield to human understanding and ultimately to human mastery. Our dreams of messianic redemption gave way to a sureness about social progressivism, and for more than a few of us, to one or another brand of scientific socialism. Our generation, that is to say my generation, which was born during and after World War II and came of age beginning in the late 1950s, was the first to reject modernism. We didn't know we were doing it. When we responded to the Beat Poets in 1959, or surreptitiously passed copies of Camus' The Stranger or The Myth of Sisyphus from hand to hand in 1960, or whatever else marked the coming of age of that group of intellectuals who were late 50s, early 60s people, we didn't realize what it was all about was a rejection of modernism. The terrible assassinations of the 60s, combined with our growing hatred for an awful war and all it represented, helped us to articulate, I think, something that had been true of us all along, in a sense, a kind of leitmotif of our existence all along that had to be brought out only in the mid-60s, as the Holocaust was discovered by Jewry only in the mid-60s. The sense that we were born under the star of absolute evil, a sense that we were somehow born with both Auschwitz and Hiroshima in our blood, is something that we, children of the Holocaust and post-Holocaust era, discovered only in the mid-60s. It was not, I think, for us so much God who died at Auschwitz as our naive faith in human progress. The world is not becoming more civilized day by day. We are not becoming better, more enlightened, more realized as we pass through human history. We were the first generation to reach adulthood conscious of the possibility of absolute annihilation. And so we bore within ourselves a twin feeling of a kind of terrible fragility, sense of fragility, with an awful rage. And that combination of fragility, defenselessness, and rage broke out into the violence of the late 1960s. And those of us who lived through Cambridge or Morningside Heights or Berkeley or lots of other places in those generations, I think will not forget any time in our lives that we were witnesses to both individual lives and society itself, very close to the brink of dissolution. I once said that I could decide to spend the next 40 years on kibbutz somewhere in Israel, or even less likely, holed up in a corner of Mea Shearim if I ever saw the light and repented my wicked ways. And yet I think I would still, of necessity, define myself primarily as a person who lived through Cambridge and Columbia of 1962, 1965, 1968. But then I will confess that I have on the wall of my study a picture of two monks standing outside a monastery overlooking a sunset, and one saying to the other, I still can't help thinking after all these years that this is the cocktail hour. So maybe we do never quite change and never quite convert fully. we have, some of us, those of us who survived psychically, and lots did not survive psychically. There's lots of human waste that came out of the late 60s and early 70s. We've stepped back from the edge of that abyss and decided to rebuild our lives. We have children, some of us even second or third families in this crazy time in which we live. Technology marches onward. I find myself even composing tirades against modernism like this on my word processor. But we are users, consumers of that technology. We're friendly with our user-friendly devices, if you will, but we're not believers in them. We're not believers. The temple of progress is no longer ours. We've seen too much of the blood of human sacrifice shed on its altar to be able to worship there anymore. Those of us who have returned to Judaism, refugees, if you will, now from the new religions of modernity, or of modernism. Unlike the generation, I think, of cathedral synagogue builders that preceded us, seek in that Judaism a profound consolation for the nerve-wracking awareness that the abyss itself, the abyss of nuclear destruction, the abyss of life in an age of mass dehumanization, has not disappeared. Having been intellectually weaned on Kafka and Camus and Allen Ginsberg, and he was important for some of us in those days, it's only a voice like that of Buber or Heschel or maybe Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, Redivivis, if you will, Jews who knew the abyss themselves and somehow were able to transcend it, that can begin to speak to us of what religious life is all about. We find ourselves open to the possibility of deep and transforming inner experiences, and yet suspicious even of them. We seek a Judaism that somehow addresses and enriches our souls, and yet at the same time allows us and encourages us to somehow go on with the work of transforming at least the small arena, if not the great society in which we live. We did, after all, have to learn from the blacks again in the mid-1960s, the message of Amos and Isaiah that we had forgotten for a long time, that transformation of the self and the soul and transformation of the society around you nurture one another and are not ultimately opposed to one another. What will be the Judaism of the future? I can't say. I can't say not only because I am neither a prophet nor the son of one, but because I don't believe there will or even should be a single Judaism in the future. I am convinced, almost beyond everything else, of the importance of pluralism in the Jewish future. I find myself committed to pluralism, even to a degree of individualism, in the building that needs to be done. We have before us a great and rich tradition of the past. Every one of us has access, a right, an obligation to seek out some kind of contact with all of that past. I don't want any of that past. I don't want any of that cultural legacy. I don't want any of that spiritual baggage to be claimed only by one group of Jews, to the extent that it can't be the property of all the others. I rejoice when I see new words out of the tradition reclaimed by people who weren't using them before. A few years ago, I think it was the Hillel Foundation in Los Angeles sent me a brochure that they were running a Mesivta of Jewish studies. I love the idea that on the college campus somebody outside the Orthodox community was running a Mesivta, or that somebody outside the Yiddishist community was using Yiddish and feeling comfortable with it and feeling that it was theirs. It was theirs as Jews, or somebody outside the small circle of committed Aliyah-oriented Zionists was able to use Israeli things and make them theirs. All of it belongs to all of us. And therefore, the Judaism which each of us will create, Each individual, each family, each minyan, each chavurah, each community, each of the many new groups that's going to emerge and mold one little corner or another of the Jewish future, is going to make a selection, is going to choose what out of the whole tradition, and I say tradition in the broadest sense, is going to speak to him, her, or them. I would say that a Jew who says no to any Jewish possibility, and this means prophetic social action for the Orthodox as well as mikveh or shatnez for the liberal, has, to use an old metaphor, cut off a limb. None of us knows what aspect of the tradition or what aspect of Jewish life will become Torah for us tomorrow, will become a source of edification, a source of personal growth. Alongside that excitement I feel about the variety of Judaisms that are mushrooming everywhere, and about the right of people and the obligation of people to pick and choose and to put together their own Jewish packages and to decide what kind of Jewish life they want. And I think one of the things we rabbis and educators and seminary deans should be about is empowering people, is saying, yes, you have the right to form your own Jewish life. Yes, you have the right to make your own decisions. No, you don't have to do what the rabbi does. No, you don't have to do what others have decided is their package of Jewish life. All of us are pickers and choosers. I finally came to realize that when I was talking to one of the elders of the Bratslav Hasidic community in Jerusalem some 10 years ago, and was talking to him about the hour of broken-hearted prayer that every Bratslav Chassid is supposed to say. Every day, a Bratslav Chassid is supposed to do what's called Pravan Isboididus, to conduct an hour of broken-hearted conversation with God in private. And this elder of the Bratslav community said, I asked him, do you still do Isboididus every day? And he said, yes, of course we do, but sometimes only for 3/4 of an hour. So then I understood that we're all conservative Jews. So that was all right. At the same time, there are problems in that. With all the excitement about that, and it is exciting and it is good, and it is to be encouraged, there are problems. There's a decline in the factors that unify us. We and Israel no longer have a common language. There's been a tremendous decline in the last 20 or 30 years I've seen in the knowledge of Hebrew among American Jews, including American Jewish educators and rabbis. We don't have a common language. More important, we, American Jews and Israeli Jews, don't have a common experience. I don't know how to talk about Judaism to Jews whose essential Jewish experience has been that of fighting and seeing their friends die for their Jewish life, for the survival of their Jewish country. They have a depth of experience that's so utterly alien to my own depth of experience that it's almost impossible for me to feel I have the right to talk across that chasm. Makes it very hard. The same, of course, is happening between Orthodox and heterodox Jews in the United States, and we're all deeply concerned with it. I think the issues that divide us are real, and those real issues come to be overlaid by a kind of dose of small-mindedness and denominationalism and pettiness, all of which go together in my mind, which are the real bane of Jewish existence. As for me and the people I speak to most directly, those of us who are spiritual refugees, seekers, come out of the experiences of the mid-60s, returning to Judaism but wanting to refashion Judaism, finding ourselves indeed religious people, and yet not really spoken to by the traditional religious language of Judaism, if you take it literally. Friends have told me for years that I have chosen to study Jewish mysticism because I really wanted to be a Buddhist. It wasn't meant as a joke line. And indeed, I probably have found ways of saying things I wanted to say religiously in Jewish language. And I think what makes them Jewish is their language, and I'll be happy to talk more about that later. So for us, the Judaism of the future will somehow be centered in God, will have to be centered in God, but less in God as a heavenly commander than in God as the still small voice that lies deeply hidden within the self. A voice that's too frightened by the terrifying pace of modern and even postmodern living to make itself heard, and which therefore has to be cultivated, has to be nurtured, has to be brought out in us. And the bringing out of that voice within us, which is God, and the ability to share that voice in community is what our Judaism is all about. I'm a teacher, and so I have to teach something. My radical theology, and I do continue to see myself as a radical theologian despite what some of my students think about me. My radical theology begins with a couple of vertlach, a couple of expressions by two of the Hasidic masters, and with these I'll more or less close. One is by Mordechai Yosef of Ishbitze, who was the disciple of the Kotzker. The other was by Abraham Joshua Heschel, but the first one, the rabbi of Apt. The Ishbitzer commented on the verse, Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elohechem. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. He said, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's not a commandment. It's not a commandment. It's a plea. The Shekhinah, the presence of God, says to the human being, wherever you go, whatever you do, I'm part of you. Wherever you take me, I can't be separated from you because I dwell inside you. Please, therefore, don't take me any place too defiled, because it hurts me too much to go there. Be holy, for I, the Lord God, within you, am holy. Which is to say, the life of holiness, bringing into ordinary times and ordinary places and ordinary events what Jews originally associated with the special holy place and the special holy moment and the special holy man, is still what Jewish spiritual life is all about. That doesn't stand and fall, we have found, on whether there is a divine imperative to do it in precisely one way or another, but can be, if you will, reconstructed on the basis of the search of the soul for a more subtle sense of divine presence that exists within the self and within others. The other, just to show you how my Reconstructionism and my Neo-Hasidism somehow come together, the Apter Rav read the verse, what does the Lord God want of you? Verse in Deuteronomy, what does the Lord God want of you? He says, the Lord God wants of you what? The word what in Hebrew is ma. Ma, because of numerical equivalencies, which play a great basis in the Hasidic word game, gematria it's called. The word what does God want of you equals 45, and the word Adam, human being, also equals 45. So this is, what does God want of you? God wants Adam of you, which was to say for his ordinary hearers, those who heard him talk and just understood the superficial level of it, God wants you to be a mensch. God doesn't want anything more of you than that you be a mensch. But then he said, no, it doesn't only mean that. He says, this Adam that God wants of you is the Adam of Ezekiel's vision, because the prophet Ezekiel, at the heights of mystical ecstasy, sees the chariot and sees a throne on top of it, and on top of the throne he sees Adam. He sees a human figure. And so the Apter says that this human figure, which is on the throne in heaven, comes only from you. And that's what God wants of you. In my language, our task is to make God human. Only we place the human form on that heavenly throne. Which is to say, I'm a non-believer who's a believer, or a believer who's a non-believer. The terrible, faceless universe, the mystery that takes life as arbitrarily as it gives it, and seems to know no justice, and seems to know no limitations. That universe needs to be given a human face. Only we can make it human. Only when it becomes human can we love it. Only then can we really begin to transform it, not by manipulation, but by finding that it is, after all, divine, and by being able to address it as thou, as ata. And so the final word is that this is what it's all about. And if we dedicate ourselves to this kind of vision, a vision which really ultimately knows no bounds of denominationalism and knows not even the seemingly great boundary between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, if we devote ourselves to that, we will somehow find that the questions which separate us, which really have to do with authority and with exactly how much has to be done, how rightly, are somehow second-level questions. They seem so great because we've stopped allowing ourselves to address the primary level questions. Somehow the rabbis a long time ago were smarter about these things than we seem to be these days. They spent a seemingly infinite amount of time talking about exactly how you should do this and exactly how you should do that. And then they taught us, Echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamitu vilvad sheyechaven et libo lashamayim, which I would somewhat playfully translate, one does more, one does less. Really doesn't make much difference. Just turn your heart to heaven. That, I think, will be the real religious task of Jewish religion as it enters the 21st century. Will we be able to turn away from the petty, turn away from small-mindedness, and realize that all of us are laboring together in the same task, and that the root that unites us goes deeper than the branches into which we are divided. Thank you.
Art did not tell you the full story of our original encounter, which was that Blue and I were married. That was the first professional position I took, and became the Hill director at Brandeis. And the first job we had was the supposed kosher kitchen at Brandeis. And we needed help, and Art Green volunteered, and so through many days and nights we stood there cooking up a storm to kosher it, and I knew then that Art would never be satisfied just with academia, but would also have a Jewish communal service dimension to his life from then on. And I remember we needed more and more pots and pans because we were constantly cooking up stuff for koshering purposes, and we couldn't get them. He would keep going back to the steward and the master chef, demanding more pots. And one day the chef said to him, "Why are you tormenting me?" And I knew that someday Art would write a book called Tormented Master Chef. The true story of our life together. Well, of course, I'd like to reflect upon our topic, the shape of the future, from my own perspective as well. And I share Art's feeling that we are living through an age of transformation. I'd like to reflect not so much on the Holocaust in Israel as the elements there, but rather on the general cultural revolution we're living through, because I think that in particular has had enormous impact on the whole question of relativism with which this series has been dealing. We are living through what obviously is, in many ways, an unprecedented historical experience. It's the open society, on the one hand, socially, politically open as never before, combined with media and communication of extraordinary power and saturation. It's a high communication society. We all hear about knowledge, information explosions, and so on. But the result, of course, is that every lifestyle and every value system now lives in the presence of the other. And I think that is really what is so unprecedented about our values situation, not just our identity as Jews. I mean, in the past, to use the Peter Berger images, the sacred canopy or the social construction of reality could be done in some way by a religion, by one particular society, by one particular group. And of course, they had an ability to create so totally encompassing a reality that it was really experienced as kind of universal. It was experienced somehow as objective and a description of the reality. It created a world in which our own values were self-evident, and of course, at least, if not self-evident, and superior. Now, of course, you have this incredible reversal, which I think has really stunned everybody. It's simply no longer possible to do that, but rather you have kind of total exposure simultaneously. Even as you stand within one world of values, you have total exposure simultaneously to every other set around. And of course, this is a shock not just to Jews, it's a shock really to all inherited values. And I would say the crisis of Jewish identity is mirrored and matched by the crisis of values all around us. It's kind of ironic that Peter Berger, in his Heretical Imperative, stresses this fact that in a sense, in the past, the private, i.e. the group, could project these universal values, but now it's almost a reversal that the universal values are now experienced as private, precisely because even if they're universally held, there are alternate views, if not in this society, then somewhere else, and all that is funneled in simultaneously through the media. So it ends up that even what was perceived as cosmic experiences are now subjective, projected, and so, of course, privatized, weakened, and ultimately relativized. Now, of course, it's almost, in a sense, I look back now, I mean, I lived through it myself. It's part of the fact I look back at my own life and sort of realized it's literally living on this, or living through it. And it cuts so deep, and it really reverses so many things. You know, I lived through it personally. I look back now, I lived through as a child World War II. And of course, to have grown up and then come through not only, you know, down to the Vietnam experience, I sort of look back, what's my strongest memory of World War II? Well, of course, it isn't really even a news story, it's a movie. I have this very strong memory, it's my most powerful memory of World War II, which is the story of Wake Island. Now, this is a movie, I'm surprised I did not get applause from the audience. Obviously, you're not old enough to have lived through together. But of course, Wake Island starred my great hero, Robert Taylor. And as a child, I was determined to see this movie. And of course, my parents, to my utter chagrin and shock, told me I can't go see it. And this is really my most unforgettable memory of World War II, because, you know, I was so determined to see Robert Taylor that I wasn't going to take no for an answer. So I remember as a 9-year-old yeshiva bacher, Yeshiva Yitz Greenberg in Borough Park, I finally decided to do the ultimate sin. I was going to rebel against my parents, cut school, and attend and see Wake Island at the Loews Borough Park. So I remember coming out of school and walking that block. It was the longest block in the world. You know, I knew I was going straight to hell, but for Robert Taylor, it was worth it. And I came up to this movie. Really, I mean, it's just the most vivid memory of my childhood. I came to this movie. I arrived at the box office, and then the most stunning reversal of all, I discovered that the Loews Borough Park had a deal with the yeshiva. They wouldn't let kids in during school hours without an adult. You know, I'd burned my bridges behind me. I couldn't go back. You know, I'd lost my soul, eternal damnation, and I couldn't get into the movie. It was the most, I began to cry. In fact, what went through my mind was the saddest verse in the whole High Holidays Machzor, you know, which is, we departed from your worthy commandments, and it wasn't even worth it. I didn't know what to do, really. I just started to cry. I couldn't go back. I just started to cry. And of course, along came this old man. At the time, I didn't appreciate it. Many years later, I realized it was Eliyahu Hanavi, but at the time, he asked me why I was crying, and I explained to him, and he bought a ticket, he took me in, and then he left. He didn't want to see the movie, but he didn't want this child to be deprived. So this experience alone would have guaranteed this most memorable movie of my life. And yet, you won't believe it, it was topped by the movie. Why? Because the story of Wake Island is that after 42 days and nights, the Japs who were trying to capture Wake Island, and they have been shelling it and bombing it for 42 days and nights. The Marines are totally cut off. There's a handful of Marines left with Robert Taylor and Brian Donlevy, and they're surrounded totally by the Japs, who are about to conquer the island. And they're landing all these troops, and out comes Robert Taylor. After 40 days and nights, no water, no food, no shelter, his suit is pressed. He is clean. He looks like a hero, not like today. And I knew he would do it, and they put him on the beach with one machine gun to hold off the 40,000 Japs while the Marines escape. He's not afraid. He stays, come on, you guys. He stays with a machine gun. The Japs hit the beach. He starts mowing them down. They're dropping like flies. I'm wrong. Before they drop dead, they stick their buck teeth out so you should know they're Japs. And of course, they're dropping like flies. And as the movie ended, they're dropping like flies. We all gave them a standing ovation. That's my strongest memory of World War II. Now you compare that to any scene that goes through your mind from the 1960s and Vietnam, and you understand the impact of this revolution. My strongest memory of Vietnam, a little girl on fire, running down the road from my people's napalm, or the look on the face of a guerrilla shot by the police chief of Saigon, where you see the pain, the full human pain on his face, and you cringe inside that it's my side that did it. There you have, I think, in one shorthand, the incredible revolution of the world we live in. Now, of course, it's no accident that Vietnam was the most opposed war in history. I look back now and I say to myself, having come to grips with it a little bit, I do consider this a moral breakthrough. I believe that through this communication, we are living through what is, in effect, the discovery of the image of God, the Tselem Elokim, of the other. Because the tradition always claimed that if you knew a human in their fullness, you would know their uniqueness, you would know their equality to yourself, you would know their infinite value, you would feel it, then you would respect it. It's no accident that the Ethiopian famine, after all, is not the first famine in human history. What's different about it is that the media brought it into the home, and you saw not strange numbers far away which died with indifference to you, but you saw living children with swollen bellies, and you could not be indifferent. That's the moral breakthrough. You compare that to the Nazi attempt to turn Jews into numbers. They understood what they were doing. That if you see people as numbers and in rags, you can kill them, but if you see them in all their fullness, you can't. That's the power of the accomplishment of the time we're living in. But there's also a crisis that's come with it, and I think that crisis also has affected each of us profoundly. And you know it. It's that once you get to know the fullness of the other, once you appreciate the uniqueness and the infinite value of the alternate, can you make any judgments at all ever again? That's my nightmare. I mean, I sort of many times think, can you imagine World War II, we would have had TV. I have this mental nightmare. CBS takes you on person to person with Ed Murrow, the old days, to visit Rudolf Huss, the commandant of Auschwitz. You visit his home on a nice Christmas night. We have eyewitness accounts. He was kind to his dog. He was a very gentle man, very kind to his dog. In fact, one prisoner once stepped on the dog's toe and he stomped him to death to punish him for hurting this dog. But I have a mental image of, TV visiting this lovely man, kind to his dog, sweet to his family, singing Christmas carols. Who would want to go fight him? That is the question, the capacity to make judgments that all of us are really feel, in a sense, nervous about. Vietnam was wrong, maybe. In retrospect, I'm not as confident now as I was then when I was campaigning actively against it. But is there any war that I wouldn't be against once I see the fullness of the suffering? It was very uncomfortable as Jews to see Lebanon. Was it because Israel was so off the wall, or because for the first time I as a Jew saw the fullness of the humanity of the Arabs and not just as hateful caricatures? And even in a just war, would I be able to fight? I'm not so sure anymore. That's the crisis we're all struggling with together. Homosexuality, when I grew up, was simply out of the question. Now, thanks to media, I've come to see that there is authentic, caring, family love in homosexuality. Now can I make a judgment and say that nevertheless, I do not treat it as equal, or it is the ultimate logic, the acceptance of the gay synagogue and the feeling of the legitimate, equal, authentic sexuality, alternate lifestyle? I can't answer the question as much as I have some feelings about it, but I'm saying this is the dimension of the question that everybody's wrestling with. Is it true that tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner? And that there is nothing between those two choices. On the one hand, A world in which one makes no judgments anymore? You remember that article by the Harvard professor about guilt-free history? He was getting back papers from his students in his European history course. The SS did their thing and the Jews did their thing. And who am I to make judgments? And I've begun now to come across memoirs that present the SS very sympathetically and understandingly. And on the other hand is the choice, because we're seeing it around us, either narrowness, a closed-off quality, which would take a major effort to recreate. And indeed, I think what you're seeing around you, in not just the rise of moral majority, but in a kind of Khomeini situation, where people desperate for some absolutes, they are prepared to do radically, culturally destructive things in order to recreate a world where you can still make a judgment. That, in a sense, I think, is the dimensions of the being torn apart that we all feel, and some admit it more than others. In a way, it's the end of the protective tariff that every value system had. And here again, I would like to believe, and I believe it, that it forces us, when you lose the protective tariff, it forces you at a higher level of efficiency and performance. I think of marriage again, which lost its protective tariff in the 60s and 70s, and the initial impact was very devastating. But I see now, and I think in a long-term point of view, leads to a higher level of performance. People understand it. To stay married, you're going to have to work harder, try harder. All my friends are out jogging. I ask them, what are you doing? They say, well, I have to stay in shape for my wife. That's different. That's different than the past. I noticed the women in my community, in my synagogue, try a lot harder to stay intellectually alive, physically attractive. It's no longer that I'm married once and that's it and it's settled. In a sense, I would argue that this has led to a higher level of performance. And on the other hand, this is, of course, the best possibility. And on the other hand, how does one reconcile that kind of reality with making judgments? Because I believe, maybe it's just my bias, my reactionary quality, the fact that I was raised in the old society, therefore I'm not the new man or the new whatever it is one is going to raise in this new era. I believe that ultimately if there is no judgment, then there is no morality and no humanity. But where does one draw the strength for those judgments, and how are they made? Or to put another way, can one reconcile serious and absolute commitments with the truth that there are other values and other realities that are morally, intellectually as powerful as mine? Can there be a kind of an absolute pluralism, or pluralist absolute? I'm not sure quite how one phrases it. And I wrestle with it all the time. I sometimes think that maybe I'm dangerous, that the ultimate logic of my own thinking is going to be to subvert orthodoxy from a commitment to another voluntary lifestyle one puts on and off, like what puts on fashions. When I see some of the more gross or vulgar versions of American society, when I see sometimes how the ultimate spiritual experiences are turned into interesting options and lifestyle changes and fashions, I think maybe I am a danger and maybe should be suppressed. And on the other hand, I can't escape the feeling that in the course of this struggle, that orthodoxy will become less hateful, less judgmental, more mature, more responsible to its God as well as to itself. And I don't know. I mean, this is what I think what we all wrestle with each other and with ourselves. Now, I have one or a couple of suggestions maybe about possible paradigms. I'm convinced what I'm trying to say is, therefore, I think there's serious work that needs to be done in this area. And I think that we have taken for granted either the natural relativization that came out of the cultural explosion, or we allow these kind of shrinking areas of absolutes rather than to begin to confront the hard question of what kind of models could guide us in the new situation. One possibility has occurred to me is that we all do operate out of fundamental paradigms of knowledge and of judgment on bases of knowledge and of values. That maybe in a sense what we're wrestling with in our lifetime is a shift, not from absolutism to relativism, not even from fanaticism to humaneness, but maybe a shift from a kind of Newtonian moral values universe, one in which there is an absolute center, to a kind of Einsteinian universe in which, as it were, because what I see in the physical images that Einstein offers of is a world in which there is no absolute center of the universe, but there are indeed systems the observer themselves. In a sense, the universe is organized around the observer. The observer affects the center of the universe, but within a particular system, it is an absolute. Even though there's more than one such system and more than one absolute center, it is not simply just another point along a continuum. That maybe, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that these underlying paradigms, physical theory, very profoundly affect the way social sciences or the way philosophy understand themselves, and that maybe we should be struggling with a little more is these images in which there are at once both absolute and yet subjective dimensions, rather than continuing to argue off the models that grow out of a previous kind of uniform world of philosophy and of values. In the Einsteinian universe, gravity is not a force simply that operates propagated through the air, but is a kind of almost a curvature in space in which each body affects the very curvature of the so-called objective space in which we live. Maybe the counterpart in religion is that religion is a curvature in the track of orientation to God, in which the presence of any one religion, any one group, affects the curvature of every other group, just as every movement of every body and every shift in the physical universe affects the standing of every other body in the physical universe. So in some way does each religion affect the presence of the other, and yet they all stand in some orientation to the God who transcends them all. It's one possible image, but I think what it points away from is in fact the relatively easy comparisons and relativization that we have offered up to now. A second model, it seems to me, grows out of our own Judaism, which is that the Torah itself presents itself not merely as a revealed truth or even a value system, but as a way of perfecting the world, which is handed over and worked through humans, through a covenant and human carriers. In a sense, what it's saying there too is you have simultaneously command, connection to transcendent and absolute, and at the very same time you have an affirmation of the human role, both in carving that way, in shaping that way, in achieving it, that makes in a sense the goal absolute, but the tactics and along the way, and that's what all of life is about, not only relative, but shapeable and reshapable by humans. It's no less absolute a commitment that I know there's more than one way to that final goal. I take that way that I commit to much more seriously. I think the big weakness I see in contemporary Jewish life is that people, having discovered the truth of the pluralism, then turn that into a kind of a casualness of not holding myself to a standard. And it's something I try to learn all the time from my right-wing friends and critics, to hold myself to a standard, sometimes even when it's not very comfortable, or sometimes when it seems to be the thing I don't want to hear. And the third model, perhaps, in paradigmatic terms, the Holocaust itself. One of the lessons I have come to, at least in some way, begin to grasp in the Holocaust understanding is that maybe the central paradigm of perfection is not a good paradigm, that somehow at the very internal core of the world there is a flaw or a crack, expressed in so cosmic and so destructive an event, somewhat like the Shvirat HaKelim image in Lurianic Kabbalah, the breaking of the vessels. And therefore, I've come to feel that the explanatory paradigm itself must see itself as broken, that the very claim to absolute is correct as long as you understand it can't account for everything. The absolute is correct if it understands that it is in some places broken, therefore it can account for 80% or 90%, whatever it can account for, but it cannot deal with the rest. When I was a kid, I remember Henry Morgan, the comedian, used to make fun of Drew Pearson's claim of being a very prophetic, good predictor. He used to always make fun of Drew Pearson. Always just announce Drew Pearson's prophecies are true 80% of the time, whatever it was. Morgan used to say, Drew Pearson, the man whose predictions are 90% true, 10% of the time. Somehow, maybe that in fact is a fundamental understanding that we have to see, that over the curve or over the range of the particular idea, it is true and even absolute, but it only can cover a certain amount of reality, and beyond it there is something else that covers the rest. I offer this only in the sense that I think the people who are most committed, both to pluralism and liberalism and to values, have in some way, I think, to begin to focus more on these issues rather than simply offer statements of pluralism or even of values as the two alternatives. Now, how would I apply what I'm saying to the future of the Jewish people in the United States? For one, I think we are, as a community, living through this extraordinary discovery of freedom and choice as we never had before. And it has had a very powerful effect. The initial effect, very subversive of Jewishness. people discovering you don't have to stay Jewish, people losing the push of anti-Semitism and persecution. The initial reaction, in a sense, has been a shift from tradition, and I would even say commitment, toward an anything goes, including a lot of people checking out. And even from those who stay within, a shift from tradition and nostalgia and sentiment toward choice, because the consciousness of choice becomes the overwhelming reality, even for Orthodox Jews, the sense of choice. And the result, I would argue, is a polarization within every group. The freedom to be more frum, more observant, the freedom to be more principled, has affected every kind of Jew. As the United States itself shifts from accepting Jews, but giving a message that in order to be fully accepted, you must assimilate, toward a message that says, be yourself. That's our acceptance, a whole different level of experience. And I believe that each group is going through this crisis. I mean, Reform, for example, having been the most successful in adjusting to the United States, now finds the crisis that with that kind of open acceptance, a lot of the tacit and covert shelters and barriers to assimilation are down. So that in a sense, the very success in identifying with Americanism becomes a vulnerability. And Reform responds in polarized fashion. On the one hand, a search for more tradition. I mean, you have now Reform mystics, right? You have Larry Kushner. You know, I presume Kaufman Kohler is turning over in his grave. You have Reform that moves toward discipline, toward a sense of committed to day schools or to the task force on standards, which now seeks to evoke a kind of a disciplined observance level within Reform. You get the shift toward commitment, whether it be Nifty or Yahel. I mean, in a Reform kibbutz, people going off to pioneer in the desert. HUC and the whole development of a whole wing within that rabbinical school of people who are seeking more discipline, more commitment, more observance, on the one hand, and simultaneously, and out of the same reaction, I would say, and out of a principled reaction, except a principled reaction that has accepted a different set of principles, you see a radical shift toward humanistic Judaism, a willingness to affirm intermarriage as a positive phenomenon, a patrilineal decision that says we'll serve these people whatever the impact on the tradition, because we're no longer hung up. We're free to choose, and therefore Reform is not traditional about less things than Orthodoxy, but is free to make voluntary choices that radically reject all aspects of the tradition and accept yet others quite freely and without apology. And we see the same kind of polarizing effect going on within all of the groups. In Orthodoxy, we see now, with the pressure off to Americanize, you see, on the one hand, a much more aggressive affirmation of Orthodoxy, more outreach, more willingness to sell and to missionize. We see the Baal Tshuva phenomenon, or Lubavitch, and so on the one hand. We see more unyielding Orthodoxy, more demanding of its own people and of others. It becomes a competition, the Chomer of the Week kind of club, to see who can outdo the other. A much franker delegitimation of the other groups without apology, because they're not intimidated by American civil religion. They're not intimidated by the notion that liberalism or pluralism is the American way. And on the other hand, I think we see within Orthodoxy also, more people willing to say there is a choice, that Orthodoxy is not merely accepting what came before, but that there is halachic power to renew and to change and to apply in new ways. We see feminist affirmations within Orthodoxy, and a moral critique of the tradition from within, without the soft soap and without the apologia that if it's God or it's the Rishonim, it must be perfect. We see a willingness to explore new social relationships between men and women, side by side with the demand for the tichel and greater separation, and they go hand in hand. People willing to affirm power and affluence and the secular, at the same time that one sees a demand for greater withdrawal. And I think the conservative Reconstructionist movements, and it's unfair to lump them together, but there's also a time factor, we see the same kind of polarization going on. We see the same kind of polarization. More search for tradition, more willingness to affirm it, more halakha, more observance, more day schools. Simultaneously, and as an expression of the same freedom and the same raising of commitment, with a willingness to ordain women rabbis, even if that is perceived by others as violating the tradition, a willingness in the Chavurah to be creative and add new ritual, not merely to preserve the old. And of course, I have to say, in all fairness, as part of the same phenomenon, a community in which more people are willing to say that anything goes and more rabbis willing to not enforce the very official standards of the movement. So what I'm trying to say is I think the outcome of this freedom, the most likely outcome, is a much more variegated Jewish community in which every option is taken up. I know an observant, leading Jewish thinker, married, or was at least married, to a faithful Christian. It's an oxymoron historically, but it's true. It happens in this kind of a society. I know of a marginal Jew, I know marginal Jews who would appear to be totally assimilated, whose Jewishness consists of a kind of a radicalism, but they identify consciously with a chip on their shoulder as Jews, in that radicalism and nothing else, and everything in between. And of course, we are getting really an incredible hybrids. I mean, we're getting Reconstructionists, witches, rabbis, if I understand, right? I mean, witches / rabbis. I mean, we have every possibility, if I'm to believe what I read, or as Zalman Schachter. Again, these are all incompatible things. Who would have dreamt, for that matter, that the great Reconstructionist tradition would be served by an extraordinary dean who's a mystic and a spiritual person? In the past, I would tell you, can't be done. But in fact, that's the incredible, or Zalman Schachter, who is simultaneously one of the most creative and profoundly liturgically sophisticated and deep Jews we have, who at the very same time has an ability not only to taste Hindu or Catholic liturgy, but to teach it to Catholic liturgists and Hindu liturgists. I mean, these combinations were simply impossible, but in a society of freedom of choice of this type, with that kind of communication, then it'll become possible, they become plausible. I got a letter this week from a Christian theologian who, after a lifetime of distinguished leadership, is thinking of converting to Judaism. And he wrote to me in part because the models that have had the most personal impact on him are Jewish. And I have to admit that my own spiritual search and life has been profoundly shaped by people from Reinhold Niebuhr to Roy Eckhardt in ways that very few rabbis can match. That's the experience of a community that lives in so saturated a communicative reality with the freedom of choice. Now, the danger, of course, in that I see also. The danger is, I think, that in the absence of a pluralist theology on the one hand, and that applies to all groups. I have to say again, it's not just the Orthodox who delegitimate. At the National Chavurah Institute, a group objected, in fact prevented or tried to prevent, a mechitza minyan, even though the Orthodox women wanted it, on the grounds that it's ipso facto illegitimate. It is simply inconsistent with egalitarianism, and indeed the same language that Orthodox Jews use against non-Orthodox, they used against this, and I think for good reason on both sides, because they felt they were being faithful to their principles. But you have, on the one hand, in the absence of such theologies of pluralist commitment, I think you have a real risk of course, instead of having and if we don't develop strategies of living together in this reality, it could lead to a fundamental split in the Jewish people. If this, instead of a spectrum, a continuum with the extraordinary variety, and I'll put it this way, if along that continuum, with that variety, each group broadcasts to its own group, we can have an extremely rich and successful moment. But if each group broadcasts to the other, it could easily turn into static and disruptive. And which is the message that's going to get across? To the right-wing Orthodox, half of what they see, they should only see the other half, they'd be more angry. It's hefker, it's anarchy, it's moral religious anarchy. And often it is nothing less than that. But even when it's not, it is experienced that way. And to many radicals, of course, what is going on the traditional side is nothing less than reactionary, racist, chauvinist, etc. And in some cases it is, and even where it's not, it's perceived that way. And of course, this is the dilemma I see. I mean, this is the paradox. When Americans for Safe Israel reach Jesse Helms, is this what I think it is, in fact, a triumph of counterpart reaching out to counterpart? Or is this the final nail in the coffin of respect for Israel for many a radical Jew who sees this as the final confirmation that Israel is on its way to be a fascist state? And everything in between. Or Yechiel Eckstein working with evangelicals, thus confirming the conviction of other Jews, that for the sake of Israel, all principles are being thrown down the river. We're going to need a major investment, in my judgment, in theology, in halachic development, in dialogue, intra-Jewish dialogue, to be capable of dealing with these complex realities. The community goes on living with the belief that American pragmatism and Jewish non-theological orientation can handle all problems. I would say it's become a threat to Jewish survival. And that I think we've got to develop models of committed pluralism as a major investment of time and energy and money. And in the absence of that, we're going to blow each other apart out of good conscience and of good feelings. Rabbi Soloveitchik once said, according to the Medrash at least, that the angels who came to destroy Sodom arrived, you recall, they met Lot sitting in the gate of Sodom. Soloveitchik's question, brilliant question, is why of all the times to destroy Sodom, according to the Medrash, that day Lot had been elected a judge of Sodom. Says Soloveitchik, after all these years of Sodom, the most wicked, cruel, and immoral city in the world, is allowed to live. Finally, they get one decent, honest man, a nephew of Abraham. They elect him a judge. Now you wipe out the city? There's no justice. To which Rabbi Soloveitchik answers no. He said, if you study the record of Sodom, you discover it was totally wicked and the reversal of all values. They would knock out your eye and charge you for surgery. They would totally, the laws themselves were warped and twisted. He said the one redeeming feature of Sodom was that in the past the judges were dishonest. So you could always bribe your way out or get them to subvert the law. He said, but when they finally appointed an honest man to enforce these laws, you had to wipe out the city. The danger I see now is the emergence of principled Jews in all the groups. Orthodoxy is far more consistent than it was 30 years ago. And so are the liberals. And there's nothing like principled people to wipe out the world. Because unprincipled people know their limits. Or the alternative is, forgive me, the alternative is principled people who know their limits. And that's why I say it's going to take a major investment in thought, because they're not going to simply break because they're told it's unpleasant or it's not right. They're not going to be into modernity. They're going to have to develop something consistent with their values if they're going to function all together. Those subtler combinations will have to be developed. And we're going to need at the same time a much greater effort to work out some reduction of the problems growing out of freedom. I don't think there are answers to the question. Reform is not going to surrender its freedom. But if there were joint conversion, work done by all the groups, the number of converts who are not acceptable could be reduced significantly. That's a major difference. If you want to live together, you learn to live with inconsistency, but the amount of inconsistency makes all the difference in the world. The possibility of a Reconstructionist get, Art Green had spoken and tried to develop with Zalman, in fact, at the Reconstructionist College, a beginning of a get that could, on the one hand, be done with egalitarian respect for women and with some sense of respect for what liberal values are, and at the same time, that would have the halachic requirements in many areas and therefore could perhaps meet such a standard. These are very important initiatives. They need to be developed. And within each group, within Orthodoxy, there are alternatives like this which have simply been neglected. Berkowitz's suggestion decades ago of ways of a marriage annulment was simply swept aside because the community didn't care enough to think these issues through or invest in developing them. So without a major effort, I would argue, in all candor, in my judgment, that with the removal of anti-Semitism and the pressure of the outside world, which kept us one, that freedom does not guarantee happy endings. Freedom can lead to the self-destruction as well as to higher level choices. I remind you that the Synagogue Council of America, which was set up to bring the three denominations, then there were only three, together, was in fact set up on the condition it would deal only with Gentiles. It was the fear of the Gentiles that kept us together. Now that we're totally at home in America, we're not afraid. Now that we can act out our hostility and aggression toward fellow Jews and end up splitting from each other. So I think that this is a central question that we all have to work on together. That the Jewish people, unless it understands that this is a major challenge, not just sociologically, but theoretically, unless it understands that these things don't happen automatically, but will take fundamental thinking and planning, unless the community itself raises the level of sophistication in these matters. I think again of how many Jews have given extraordinary amounts of money out of goodness of heart and faithfulness to the Baal Tshuva Yeshivot and to Lubavitch, out of their desire to strengthen Klal Yisrael, but who are not mature enough in their thinking to discern what is the side effect of this work, and is there some way I can prevent the side effect by putting pressure that it not be misused for delegitimation? That's a much more sophisticated level of giving. Unless the level of giving goes up, it'll continue to fuel the very forces that drive the Jewish people apart. I want to end with one simple word of hope, because I don't want to make it sound like I think it's a lost cause. I think it is an unprecedented challenge to live in a society where you have both freedom and choice and principle. I think it's an extraordinary gift to wrestle with those questions as against the Jew who had no choice or the Jew who lived under constant pressure and persecution. I understand full well that human freedom can lead to curing cancer or to blowing up the world. I live with hope because I think the Jewish people, like other people only more so, experiences in its own body the challenge of commitment and of pluralism, that it's not going to stay Jewish without increasing its commitment in a major way, and it's not going to be able to stay together or effectively Jewish without developing such pluralist models. I would like to think that this community can become a model of what it is to have covenantal power, not afraid of power, seeking it, we need more of it in Israel as well as in America, but seeking to exercise it covenantally instead of being afraid to take it or turning my back on it. I see this as a community that's willing to develop a mature freedom that defines itself not by the negative or against the reactionaries, but toward responsibility. And I see it as a community capable of creating, in America, a voluntary community. Historically, that also is an oxymoron, but that's within our power. But whether we manage it or whether we destroy it is in our hands. So I would say in a very real sense, the shape of the future Jewish community is too early to predict, not out of modesty and not even out of the risk of trying to be a prophet, which as you recall passed the fools, but simply because the decisions taken in the next generation will make a difference on the outcome. There's a classic case which is plastic and open. Every possibility of triumph exists, every possibility of destructiveness. How we manage it, how we use our freedom, will determine the outcome.
I think you have or soon will have small index cards like this on which to write questions. I encourage you to do so. They'll be picked up by the ushers and brought up here. And hopefully we'll still have some time to read them and respond to them. Let me begin with a question to both of you, perhaps of clarification, perhaps to induce argument where I don't see very much of it. Goldenberg tried to do this last week, and you know where it got him. Art saw the need in the development of a compelling theology for individuals. Saw the need in the creation, saw the source for it, not in the acceptance of transcendental absolutes that exist apart from individuals, but really in the recognition or giving voice to that still small voice in the human soul. Yitz, you spoke in one of your three models of an absolute paradigm or an absolute pluralism to what you defined as what you identified as the Jewish model, or the one derived from Jewish sources. Values deriving not from an absolute, but from a covenant that links an absolute with the human. Is it just my hearing, or do you, Art, in fact, see this inspiration as, in fact, deriving from the individual soul? Humanity as such can't invent, can't create. Only the individual soul can. And do you, Yitz, see that as deriving not from the individual soul, but from what the Jewish people sooner or later will select from the individual proposals? Do we have a different paradigm here, or do we really have the same one?
I'm not an absolute relativist. I'm not I'm not committed to an absolute pluralism or a pluralist, certainly not to a pluralist absolutism, or I'm afraid that absolute pluralism leads to a pluralist absolutism, and that's why I don't want it. Some of you who are Shema readers may have seen me trying to deal with limits of pluralism in one particular issue that's been troubling me lately. And I think there are boundaries. There are boundaries created by Jewish historical experience as much as there are boundaries created by what's permitted and what's forbidden by the tradition. I don't have, beyond what you might call Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, beyond a kind of sense of Jewish natural law, I don't have absolute divine imperatives, certainly not in the ritual area, and even in many parts of the moral ethical area. And so I find that these are really things which have to be worked out by human community, and hopefully by a human community that is trying to realize within itself a life of holiness or the presence of God. That is not the same thing as saying they are commanded and therefore we have to do them. It's not the same thing at all. And in all of those questions of defining the limits, we are dealing with human questions and the needs of human beings to sometimes test the waters and see how far the limits can be stretched. I find myself sympathetic to experimentalism to a very great extent, and then find that there are limits, I would say, of both personal and Jewish authenticity. Steve defined me in the first introduction tonight as a kind of classicist. And I do believe that the language of the tradition can only be violated so much before what is essentially Jewish is vitiated. I think what is Jewish has a lot to do with language. I like to ask myself how Jews say those things and how within the canons of Judaism you can express certain ideas and so on, and how Jewish religious language has been used and bent and rebent and reshaped to serve different ideologies, but still somehow has maintained continuity with the past. I'm always interested in crazy Hasidic interpretations of verses, maybe less for the interpretation than for the incredible freedom they had in playing with the verse that way. So I care a lot about the continuity of Jewish language as helping to maintain the borders. I guess I want to ask Yitz, I don't know what an absolute 90% of the time is. I don't know why it's still an absolute. And once you have absolutes that operate 90% of the time, but not 100% of the time, then I have an idea we really are more on the same chessboard than I would think by the evocation of that word absolute. So maybe respond to some of that in the answer too.
If I can interject my own allusion on the same question. We all know that socialism was very attractive to a great many Jews in Europe and here, but it was a certain kind of socialism that attracted them, other kinds didn't. The kind that attracted them was, for me, best exemplified by Kurt Eisner, the leader of the Bavarian socialists, whose motto in 1919, in a very short-lived socialist revolution in Bavaria, whose motto was half the power to the Soviets. Now, there's something extraordinarily appealing in that. In its, how did Yitz put it? Self-limitation in the absolute. The recognition, the giving room to one's will, and the recognition that it may be flawed, all the same. Or if we want to speak in Jewish or even halachic terms, the subjugation of oneself voluntarily to what one perceives as the yoke of God, and the recognition that even this may be a misperception. That's, I think, a modern or postmodern idiom, but for everything I recognize as historically Jewish, it's not complete. Perhaps I have an image of what's historically Jewish that never really was. Nostalgia isn't what it used to be, after all. But how can one subject oneself to an absolute, regard it as an absolute, but in some sense constrain it to have effect only in certain realms of one's experience? Say it ain't perfect. It seems to diminish what we yearn for as an absolute.
Right. Well, Chris, Sam, your last comments bring back to what the question you initially posed to Art and to me, but because I'd like to respond to because I share that. I mean, frankly, I'm a great admirer of Art. The whole focus on the individual that he gave before, however, I felt was Art is most American, and I mean that not fully as a compliment, in the sense that I think that we are all. I mean, I pick up these same things too, and I have very strong individualist tendencies also. But the truth is, with all the importance of the soul and of the individual seeker, and even of the spirituality, which I think Art has exemplified, not merely taught, I really feel that the classic focus has been in a community, and I think that's the way all humans function eventually. Even the individualism takes place within a community. When you have a society that's totally individualist, there's no individualism either, because it disintegrates and it turns into the jungle or into other forms of alienation that I think are even more destructive. So that I would argue that, yes, 5% or 10% of the future seekers, but they're going to, and I think they may be the saving remnant, but they're not going to be the saving remnant unless there's an 80% around them of people who are not soul searchers and who are not into God, but who create a framework, whether that framework be a sense of the body of the Jewish people. Well, you were talking at the beginning about the ethnic decline. I find that very worrisome. I think ethnic borscht and memories are not enough to live off, but the Jewish religion's always struck me as so profoundly the body of the Jewish people, not just its soul. And there's nothing more American, and I mean this now again, unflattering, than to think in terms of the centrality of religion in Jewish life. 100 years ago, in the name of that, they were repudiating Israel and Zionism, and now they're not. But I still think there's the same tendency, which is to glorify the soul at the expense of the body. It's very, I wouldn't say un-Jewish, but I'd say it's very much a loss, an impoverishment, I think, of the range of the tradition. So I would argue that we have to think in a communal sense, not because the individual is not important, but because you create a framework within which 10% will be soul searchers, 15% will be political activists, 12.5% will be giving charity and nothing else, but raising money for Israel. I mean, this is you have to think in those terms. And the honest answer is, if the 12% who raise charity, or the 15% who are political activists, create a certain kind of environment, there'll be not 5%, but 10% spiritual soul searchers. And if the soul searchers don't pull off into a kind of solipsistic self-fulfillment, but stay connected to the community, then the 15% political activists will come out differently also. So I think we have to think in the ecology and in the interaction rather than one or the other. Now, as far as the absolutism and the pluralism, what you said, Sam, said better than I said my whole talk. I wish I had said it that way. What I'm trying to get across, and I throw this back to Art, when you drew the line, and I was very impressed with what you wrote in Shema about the limits of language. When you drew the line, I mean, I was sort of shocked at the response. I thought it was tough to be in the Orthodox community. I was sort of shocked at the response, which was, I felt, far from answering to the point, really became very much delegitimating and very much personal, ad hominem, ad personam, not ad hominem. I guess I can't use that sexist term. But the point I make is that I think in some way, the question becomes, is that a nostalgic or emotional, sentimental response of Art Green? Or is there, in fact, some criteria of judgment? That's what I was trying to get at. Now, the minute I affirm the criteria of judgment or the idea of coherence, to me, the important thing is not that God commanded, because as you know, I've written, in my judgment, the fact that God has commanded is absolutely secondary today. I affirm God's command, but it's absolutely secondary. No Jew keeps it because God commanded, because in my judgment, the Jew can turn around and say, God, who are you to command? I mean, are you protecting us that you can command? Are you, so For that matter, there are certain commandments that a Jew who in good conscience would have to argue with right now. So to me, the issue is not that I need God's commandment to make it credible, but rather the issue is there coherence? Is there some criterion? Can you in fact say no other than aesthetically? Is your reaction to the limit of feminist, liturgy an aesthetic judgment? Or because Art Green is hung up, as they were implying? Or is it in fact a statement that there is some fundamental principle? Now, having affirmed that, and I think it is that. But if it is that, then I immediately run into the fact that I feel there are many absolutes that need to be criticized, and I find it's totalitarian and dangerous. So yes, I would like to be the coherence, the commitment, the seriousness, the right to say no of absolute, with either the sense of humor or the sense of limit that says half the time, or half the power, or half the time, or I don't know what percentage of the time. So that's what we're struggling with. Now, my model for that is God, I would like to argue. Because in the tradition, the very notion of covenant comes, that's what it's trying to say. What it's trying to say is that if you're all powerful, you cannot function in any sort of human or love relationship with others. To the extent that God wants humans and or a love relationship with them, he has to give up the power voluntarily. So if you want, by all means strive for the power of an absolute understanding, but if you want to be able to live with that in relation to other human beings, you have to give that up, or at least some part of it, voluntarily give it up, in order to be able to live, in order for a community to function. That's why I made those jokes about principled people are so dangerous, because when they're not willing to give up or recognize their limits, they become very dangerous. And our model then is that God has voluntarily given up that power, but not the power of being absolute, it's the power of enforcing it or demanding. I'm not sure what that was given up here, that we were called to take our responsibility, and I'd like to see something of that same thing. Now, obviously, what I'm saying here sounds half inchoate, but I'm arguing that those are the kind of models we have to hammer out, and I'm not, at this point, ready to give a finished or final version. That's exactly what I think we should be working on together.
One of you wrote...
All right, I thought you were going to get mad at me when I said you're American and defend yourself. So, no? Okay.
He's been accused of worse.
I'm not going to start denying it now.
One of you wrote to both rabbis, I was struck by the slight attention each of you gave to Eretz Yisrael. Other than some suggestion by Rabbi Green of its military role, there was no attention given to Israel's role in Jewish self-awareness and identity and to its cultural and religious implications. Would you please comment about these?
I don't think we avoided it. That is to say, I certainly said something not only about its military role, but about the return of kibbutz intellectuals to discovering the tradition, the phenomenon of Baalei Tshuva, which happens as much in Israel, maybe more in Israel than it does here, my distress at the growing distance, cultural distance, as well as linguistic distance, but linguistic distance in the broader sense, a different language of experience that North American Jews and Israeli Jews have. So I think there are real issues facing us and Israel as we talk about building a Jewish future together for the whole Jewish people. Of course, Israel's had a tremendous role in the reawakening of our Jewish identity and Jewish cultural creativity and all that. The great center of Jewish cultural creativity today is not here, but in Israel. We are, in some ways, even though I'm a firm believer in Bavel v'Yerushalayim and a bipolar Jewish society, if I ask myself honestly where the real center of Jewish cultural creativity is, of course it's in Israel and not here. And
why do you say that, Art?
Why?
In what areas?
Really the secular and aesthetic areas. We spent half a year in Israel this year. And going to theater in Israel, I dislike almost everything I've ever seen in American Jewish theater, Anglo-Jewish theater in this country. I find it so low level. I find it so much lowest common denominator. I remember the experience a few years ago of seeing a production of Yentl here, on stage, I mean, not the film, and then seeing the Kamari Theater do it in Israel. And the Kamari Theater in Israel didn't have to explain to people what a mikveh is and what a yeshiva bacher is and what the shtetl was, and it could begin dealing with the real issues in the play. This year, seeing Agnon on stage and seeing other kinds of things on stage, even my own experience with my book. I wrote a book about Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. It was translated into Hebrew, published by Am Oved, the Kibbutz Movement Press. Given the size of this society and the size of Israeli society, it's interesting that it sold in absolute numbers more copies in Hebrew than in English. Which I don't say to toot my horn about how many Israelis are reading my book, I hope you understand, but Israelis begin knowing who Nachman of Bratslav is, and they can then go on to the issues. I have trouble being a Judaica scholar in this country. I don't know if Jews are in Golis, but I certainly know the Jewish scholars are in Golis. I am so sick of writing articles that begin Hasidism, comma, a mystical revival movement among East European Jews in the 18th century, comma, the Baal Shem Tov, comma, a charismatic figure among, and so on. You can begin in Israel, cultural creativity of all forms can begin in Israel. Listen, as much as we will bemoan the Jewish ignorance of the secular kibbutznik, and God knows it's terrible, that secular kibbutznik begins just because of the language, because of the cultural heritage that's born within the language. And the collective memory, which is still closer, and the fact that Mea Sharim is there, and even though it's hated, it's a known quantity. There is not the degree of absolute ignorance of Jewish life that you find in Israel, that you find among American Jews. So I just think that the real Jewish creativity is mostly happening there.
That's an important statement. I'm glad you said it. I will only add to the questionnaire, I plead guilty to the question. I think it's a fair criticism, partly because I was under the impression I had to focus on American life. But it'll give me a chance to make one other point of disagreement with Art and perhaps focus on where I would say. I said that 15% or 10% will be soul searchers and 15% will be political activists. I think 50% of the Jewish people, or 60%, will be exploring holiness by the way they live secularly. Can affluence have values? Mm-hmm. Can doctors show respect for image of God in the way they practice medicine? Can academics treat students with respect? Can they write a serious, disciplined scholarship, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that in Israel, as well as in America, I disagree with Art that we don't have a common language in that sense. It's true, Hebrew has lost ground, but I think the overwhelming bulk of Jews in America still have a very powerful sense of Israel as the carrier of the Jewish body, and they further see that the Jewish body and the Jewish soul is inseparable. So I would say that Israel will continue to play a major role and a strong connection. I think the connection is weaker when people either assimilate on the one hand or spiritualize on the other. And I think neither is a healthy phenomenon, particularly if they become one-sided. So I would say that Israel will continue to play a central role as a focus of Jewish loyalty, as a spiritual challenge to Jewish people. Now, will Israel create a translation of its political action into religious spiritual life? Art very subtly and very sensitively picked up theater and other things. Right now,
not religious creativity.
Exactly. Right. Unfortunately, right now the religious creativity is not there. The religious creativity is in creating institutions of learning of the traditional type, not in responding to the challenge of power or the challenge of a society. So I think there's a long way to go before Israel's fullness is realized as a spiritual influence. But just its existence and just its model of running that society, yes, that kind of an army, is, I think, of profound and will remain a profound spiritual influence. And I think that the ultimate tone of holiness of this community will not be set by the soul searchers and by those who find God, which is no small, it's a very important group. But I think the ultimate spiritual and human face of Judaism in America will be set by those who will create the communal, societal, political dimensions of Judaism, both in this country and in relation to Israel. So that's where I think Israel's influence will come in.
But Art, while pointing out the rich and very vast set of allusions and idiom that we share with Israelis, or that Israelis may be more articulately aware of than American Jews are even, some of what you spoke about before, about the chasm of experience that divides you from similar-aged people in Israel, sounded to me like there really wasn't a common language. That even though they may know who Nachman of Bratslav was, they don't speak about him, they don't think about him. There aren't many, if any, for you to speak with among our cohort in Israel, that they don't share that experience, and that is really the nature of the chasm, not that they have to spend 3 years and 1 month every year after in the army.
No, I've lived in Philadelphia a dozen years. I've lived in Jerusalem off and on for a few months here and there. I have more friends in Jerusalem, I would say, serious friends in Jerusalem, and people to talk to in Jerusalem than I do in Philadelphia. And a good half of those are not Americans who have been transplanted there, no. As I say, as a person who works in Jewish scholarship, I have a community of colleagues there, some of whom have become good personal friends too. I can talk to Israelis, but they are exceptional Israelis. But as you're pointing out, I talk to exceptional Americans as well. I don't want to be put in the box or put myself in the box of being entirely a spiritualist elitist. I too believe that for most people, these issues are worked out in the so-called secular avenues of life, professional, ethical, and so on. And I'm very happy to call that a part of the religious search and so forth. Those things can be discussed with Israelis, but when you get to discussing crucial issues, existential issues, the set of experiences is different. Listen, look at Israel. Why is it that among people who settle there and have lived there for 20 years, American Jews tend to hang out with American Jews and Bulgarians tend to hang out with Bulgarians? We'll never know what it was like in Sofia. And they'll never understand the experiences of Cambridge or New York or Berkeley. And that's fine. That cultural difference survives, and that, I think, will last anywhere as long as you have immigrant generations. Ultimately, a really Israeli identity will be formed or is being formed. We American Jews are not part of that Israeli identity. As you know, the Israelis, you listen to some who speak about it and write about it, have very ambivalent attitudes. I mean, secular Israeli intellectuals have very ambivalent attitudes toward their degree of brotherhood or cousinhood with us. They really think of themselves as Israelis, and yes, Jewish roots and Jewish identity are part of that, but they don't know in what way they are supposed to be related to us. I have a feeling that our sense of Jewish CLAL Yisrael may be stronger than the secular Israeli sense of Israeli identity, plus I have a relationship to the Jews in the diaspora, even though they failed, namely didn't come on Aliyah, are still somehow related to me. And that is a barrier between us. Sam, you and I just spent a couple of days in a mixed group of Israelis and Americans, bright people, interesting people. And the most the Israelis could do in relating to us was to give us Aliyah speeches. And that showed to me a real failure of ability to communicate with one another.
Well, there hasn't been such a failure tonight. I want to thank both Art Green and Yitz Greenberg for communicating so clearly, so lucidly, so articulately, and so inspiringly. And I'd like to, on behalf of the 92nd Street Y and Radius Institute, invite you to Little Wine in the back.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.